Under the cover of night, passion finally breaks free. In a forgotten cottage on the castle grounds, Isabelle and Raoul give in to their long-simmering desire. Prepare yourselves, dear listeners, for a night of passion that will set your hearts aflame and your cheeks burning. Chapter 8. A Stolen Moment. Isabelle's heart skipped a beat as she noticed the small folded paper that had been slipped under her chamber door. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it, recognizing Raoul's handwriting immediately.
Meet me at the old groundskeeper's cottage tonight, please.
She crumpled the note in her fist, conflicting emotions warring within her. How dare he ask this of her? And yet, how could she refuse? Isabelle paced her room, alternating between anticipation and dread. She couldn't possibly go. It was too risky, too improper. But the thought of seeing Raoul alone, away from prying eyes, made her pulse race. Before she could come to a decision, a sharp knock at her door startled her from her reverie.
My lady,
Marie called, her voice tight with tension.
The Baron has arrived for brunch with your father. Your presence is requested in the Great Hall.
Isabelle's stomach churned.
Thank you, Marie. I'll be down shortly.
As she made her way to the Great Hall, Isabelle steeled herself for the ordeal ahead. The Baron's very presence set her on edge, and each encounter left her feeling more trapped than ever. The brunch was as excruciating as she'd feared. The Baron dominated the conversation, expounding on his plans for expanding his lands and influence. Lord Henri listened with apparent interest, while Isabelle pushed food around her plate, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. It was as Marie was refilling the Baron's wine glass that disaster struck. The poor girl's hand trembled, causing a few drops to spill onto the pristine tablecloth. The Baron's reaction was immediate and vicious.
You clumsy fool!
He snarled, backhanding Marie so hard she stumbled backwards, the wine pitcher clattering to the floor.
My lord!
Isabelle cried, half rising from her seat in shock. The Baron turned his cold eyes on her.
You do well to learn how to manage your servants, my dear. Incompetence must be punished swiftly and harshly.
Lord Henry cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge his future son-in-law.
Perhaps we could show a bit more leniency, Etienne. Accidents do happen.
Leniency breeds weakness.
The Baron sneered. He snapped his fingers at Marie, who was fighting back tears as she mopped up the spilled wine.
You, get out of my sight, and don't expect to keep your position after we're married.
He added, glancing at Isabelle.
I won't have such incompetence in my household.
Isabelle's hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to defend Marie, to tell the Baron exactly what she thought of him. But her father's warning glance kept her silent. As the brunch dragged on, Isabelle's resolve hardened. She wouldn't spend the rest of her life with this cruel, pompous man. But it was what happened next that truly sealed her decision. As they were finishing their meal, a messenger arrived with a letter for the Baron. As he read it, a slow, malicious smile spread across his face.
Excellent news,
he announced.
It seems my petition to the king has been successful. I've been granted the right to expand my hunting grounds.
Lord Henry raised his glass in congratulation, but Isabelle felt a chill run down her spine.
Expand them where exactly?
She asked, dreading the answer. The Baron's eyes glittered with triumph.
Why, into the forest bordering my lands, of course. Those peasant hovels have been an eyesore for far too long. Once they're cleared out, it'll make for excellent sport.
Isabelle gasped.
But those people have lived there for generations. Where will they go?
That's hardly my concern. Progress requires sacrifice, my dear. You'll learn that soon enough.
As Isabelle stared at him in horror, she saw her future laid out before her, a life of silent complicity in cruelty and injustice. In that moment, something inside her snapped. She excused herself as soon as it was polite to do so, fleeing to her chambers. As she sank onto her bed, her eyes fell on Raoul's crumpled note. Suddenly, her decision was clear. She couldn't go through with this marriage. couldn't bind herself to a man she despised. For once in her life, she would follow her heart instead of her duty. As night fell, Isabelle's heart pounded in her chest, every rustle of leaves making her jump. She shouldn't be out here, shouldn't be doing this. And yet, her feet carried her forward, drawn by an irresistible force. Ahead, barely visible in the moonlight, stood the old groundskeeper's cottage. It had been abandoned for years, forgotten by all but the most curious servants. All but one knight who had once been a curious squire himself. Isabelle's hand trembled as she reached for the door. Before she could touch it, it swung open, revealing Raoul. His eyes widened at the sight of her, a mix of surprise and something deeper, more primal, flickering in their depths.
Isabelle.
He breathed, her name a prayer on his lips.
I didn't think you'd come.
She stepped inside, her cloak falling away as Raoul closed the door behind her. The cottage was small, lit only by a single candle, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls.
I shouldn't be here.
Isabelle whispered, even as she moved closer to him. Raoul nodded, his expression torn.
I know, if anyone found out.
They won't.
Isabelle said fiercely. She reached up, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw.
I needed to see you. To talk to you. After what happened in the market.
Raoul's jaw clenched at the memory.
The Baron. Isabelle, I'm so sorry. I should have done something, said something.
She shook her head, stepping even closer.
No, you couldn't have. But seeing him treat you that way, hearing the things he said.
Her voice broke.
Raoul, I can't marry him. I won't.
But your family, your duty.
Damn duty!
Isabelle cried, surprising them both with her vehemence.
I've spent my whole life doing what's expected of me. Being the perfect daughter, the perfect lady. But for what? To be sold off to a man who sees me as nothing more than a broodmare and a pretty ornament?
Tears stung her eyes, and Raoul instinctively reached out to comfort her. As his arms encircled her, Isabelle felt something inside her break. All the fear, the anger, the longing she'd been holding back came rushing out.
I want more.
She sobbed into his chest.
I want a life that means something.
She looked up, meeting his gaze.
I want you.
For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a groan of surrender, Raoul's lips crashed down on hers. The kiss was everything Isabelle had dreamed of and more. Passionate, tender, filled with a hunger that matched her own. She wound her arms around his neck, pressing herself closer, desperate to erase any space between them. Raoul's hands roamed her back, tangling in her hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily.
Isabelle?
Raoul panted, resting his forehead against hers.
I can't take advantage.
She silenced him with another kiss.
You're not taking advantage of anything.
She whispered against his lips.
I want this. I want you. Please, Raoul. Let me feel something real before...
Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by a storm of emotion, desire, love, and a deep, aching sadness.
Are you sure?
He asked, his voice rough with need. In answer, Isabelle began to undo the laces of her gown. Raoul's breath caught as the fabric slipped from her shoulders. What followed was a blur of sensation. Gentle hands and eager lips whispered endearments and stifled moans. They came together with the desperation of those who know their time is limited, each touch a declaration, each kiss a promise that could never be kept. Afterwards, they lay tangled together on Raoul's cloak, the candle burning low. Isabelle traced patterns on Raoul's chest, memorizing the feel of him.
What happens now?
She asked softly. Raoul's arms tightened around her.
I don't know,
he admitted.
But Isabelle, if there was any way at all that we could be together.
She looked up at him, seeing the conflict in his eyes. It mirrored her own, the desire for a future together warring with the reality of their situations. For a moment, Isabelle allowed herself to imagine it. A life with Raoul, filled with laughter and adventure. Children with his kind eyes and her stubborn chin, growing old together, surrounded by books and love. But the fantasy faded all too quickly. There was still her family to consider. the political alliances that depended on her marriage. And Raoul, would he really be happy throwing away his position, his honor, for her?
We should go.
Raoul said reluctantly, pressing a kiss to her forehead.
It'll be dawn soon.
As they dressed, stealing glances and soft touches, Isabelle felt a curious mix of emotions. Joy at what they'd shared, fear of discovery, and a deep, aching sadness for what could never be. At the cottage door, Raoul pulled her close one last time.
Whatever happens,
He whispered fiercely.
know that I love you. I will always love you.
Isabelle's heart soared even as it broke.
And I love you.
She replied, her voice thick with unshed tears.
Always.
They shared one final, desperate kiss before Isabelle slipped out into the pre-dawn light. As she made her way back to the chateau, her body still humming with remembered passion, her mind raced. She couldn't go through with the marriage, not now. Not after experiencing what real love felt like. But how could she escape it? What future could she and Raoul possibly have? For the first time in her life, Isabelle had no plan, no clear path forward. All she knew was that something had fundamentally changed, and whether it led to heartbreak or happiness, there was no going back. Chapter 9. Shadows of Duty. The early morning mist clung to the chateau grounds as Isabelle made her way to the stables. Sleep had eluded her, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions after her night with Raoul. As she approached, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows, causing her heart to leap. Raoul stood by her favourite mare, brushing its mane with slow, deliberate strokes. He looked up as she neared, his eyes lighting up before clouding with uncertainty.
My lady,
He said softly, bowing his head.
I hope you slept well.
Isabelle's breath caught in her throat. How could he be so formal after what they'd shared?
Raoul,
The sound of approaching footsteps cut her off. Without thinking, Isabelle grabbed Raoul's arm and pulled him into an empty stall. They pressed against the wall, bodies flush, as a stable boy walked by, whistling tunelessly. In the close confines of the stall, Isabelle was acutely aware of Raoul's presence, the warmth of his body, the quickening of his breath. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world fell away. Raoul's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing her lower lip.
Isabelle,
He whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She rose on her tiptoes, meeting him halfway in a kiss that was equal parts tender and desperate. For a few precious seconds, there was no barron, no arranged marriage, no duty. Just the two of them, lost in each other. The stable boy's whistle faded into the distance, breaking the spell. Isabelle pulled away, her cheeks flushed, her mind reeling.
we can't keep doing this.
She said, even as her body yearned to be close to him again. Raoul's eyes filled with pain.
I know, but Isabelle last night,
Was beautiful.
She finished for him.
And impossible.
They emerged from the stall, the charged moment giving way to awkward silence. Isabelle busied herself with saddling her horse, her movements jerky and uncertain.
Will you ride with me?
She asked, not meeting his eyes.
As my guard, of course.
Raoul nodded, a sad smile playing at his lips.
of course, my lady, it would be my honor.
As they rode through the misty fields surrounding the chateau, Isabelle's mind wandered to that day in the marketplace weeks ago. How different things had been then. How free she had felt, pretending to be someone else, falling for a handsome stranger. Now, that freedom felt like a distant dream. She glanced at Raoul, riding tall and proud beside her. How could she have known that the charming knight from the market would become so integral to her heart? They reached a clearing overlooking the town of Carcassonne. Isabelle reined in her horse, dismounting to stand at the edge of the cliff. Raoul joined her, maintaining a respectful distance that felt both necessary and painful.
Do you ever wonder
Isabelle began, her voice barely above a whisper.
what might have been if we'd met under different circumstances?
Raoul's silence spoke volumes. When he finally answered, his voice was heavy with regret.
Every day.
Isabelle turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears.
I can't go through with it, Raoul. I can't marry him. Not now that I know what real love feels like.
Hope flared in Raoul's eyes, quickly tempered by doubt.
Isabelle, you know I would give anything to be with you. But your family, your duty...
Damn duty!
Isabelle cried, echoing her words from the night before. She began to pace, her frustration evident in every movement.
What about my duty to myself? To my own happiness?
Raoul reached out as if to comfort her, then let his hand fall.
And what of the consequences? Your father's anger, the political fallout. Isabelle, I have nothing to offer you but my love and my sword.
His words hit her like a physical blow. Isabelle's shoulders slumped as the reality of their situation crashed over her. She thought of her father's disappointed face, of the Baron's cold fury, of the scandal that would rock Carcassonne if she ran away with a knight.
Perhaps,
She said slowly, each word an effort.
love isn't enough.
The moment the words left her mouth, she wanted to take them back. Raoul's face crumpled, a flash of raw pain in his eyes before he schooled his features into a mask of neutrality.
Perhaps not.
He agreed, his voice devoid of emotion. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. In the distance, the town began to stir, smoke rising from chimneys as the day began. Isabelle's mind raced, searching for a solution, a way out of the trap she found herself in. But every path seemed to lead to heartbreak, either her own or for those she cared about. As they mounted their horses to return to the chateau, Isabelle caught sight of her reflection in a small pond. For a moment, she saw herself as she had been in the marketplace, carefree, hopeful, full of possibility. That girl seemed a stranger now, separated by an ocean of duty and expectation. Back at the stables, as Raoul helped her dismount, their hands lingered together a moment too long. The spark between them was undeniable, a living thing that refused to be ignored.
Raoul,
Isabelle began, not sure what she was going to say. He shook his head, a sad smile on his face.
Don't, Isabelle, please. I can't bear to hear you say goodbye.
Before she could respond, he bowed deeply and strode away, leaving Isabelle alone with her tumultuous thoughts. As she made her way back to her chambers, Isabelle's resolve wavered with each step. How could she go through with this marriage now? But how could she not, with so much depending on it? She paused at a window overlooking the courtyard, her eyes drawn to Raoul's figure as he trained with the other knights. Even from a distance, she could see the extra ferocity in his movements, the barely contained emotion in each swing of his sword. In that moment, Isabelle made a decision. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between duty and desire. Something had to change. Chapter 10. Shattered Illusions. Isabelle sat at her writing desk, quill poised over parchment, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She had resolved that something must change, but putting that resolve into action proved more daunting than she'd anticipated. Every time she began to write, to her father, to Raoul, even to the Baron himself, the words failed her. A sharp rap at the door startled her from her reverie. Before she could respond, the door burst open, revealing the Baron. His face wore a mask of polite interest, but his eyes glinted with something colder.
My dear Isabelle,
He said, striding into the room without invitation.
I thought we might discuss some details about the wedding. The guest list, perhaps, or the menu for the feast.
Isabelle rose quickly, her heart racing.
My lord, this is most improper.
Nonsense. We're to be married. Surely a brief conversation is permissible.
His gaze swept the room, his lip curling slightly.
My, what quaint chambers you have.
He began to prowl the room, running a finger along the spines of her books, picking up and discarding trinkets. He muttered.
So much clutter. We'll have to remedy that once you're mistress of Chateau Sauveterre. A lady's chambers should reflect her station, not her childish fancies.
Isabelle bristled at his condescending tone, but forced herself to remain calm.
Is there something specific you wish to discuss, my lord?
The Baron turned, fixing her with a predatory smile.
Oh, many things, my dear. For instance, your wardrobe. These provincial fashions simply won't do for a baroness. And your reading material.
He plucked a volume of poetry from her shelf, flipping through it with disdain.
How frivolous. We'll need to cultivate more appropriate interests for you.
As he spoke, he continued to move about the room, touching and critiquing everything in sight. Isabelle felt as though he were marking his territory, claiming every aspect of her life as his to control.
And of course,
He continued, approaching her desk.
we must discuss your daily routine. A baroness has many responsibilities, you know. We can't have you frittering away your time with... What's this?
Isabelle's blood ran cold as the Baron's hand closed around her sketchbook.
My lord, please, that's private.
But it was too late. The Baron had already flipped open the book, his eyes widening as he took in the contents. Page after page of Raoul, his eyes, his hands, his smile. Some were quick studies, others laboriously detailed, but all of them unmistakably rendered with love. The Baron's face contorted with fury.
You little deceiver.
He hissed, hurling the sketchbook across the room.
Did you think I wouldn't recognize him? That upstart knight who dared to look at you in the marketplace?
Isabelle flinched, her mind racing. She had to defuse this situation somehow, had to protect Raoul.
My lord, please.
She began, her voice trembling.
It's not what you think. These are merely artistic studies. Nothing more.
The Baron rounded on her, his carefully crafted facade crumbling to reveal the rage beneath.
Do not lie to me.
He snarled, his face inches from hers.
I see the truth in every line, every curve. You've given your heart to this nobody.
Tears sprang to Isabelle's eyes, as much from frustration as fear.
And what if I have?
She shot back, a burst of defiance overriding her caution.
At least he sees me as more than a pretty ornament to be displayed and bred.
The moment the words left her mouth, Isabelle knew she'd made a grave mistake. The Baron's eyes narrowed dangerously, a cold smile spreading across his face.
Oh, my dear.
He said, his voice deceptively soft.
You really don't understand your position, do you? This marriage will happen whether you like it or not. Your precious knight will be dealt with, and you will learn your place.
He stepped back, smoothing his rumpled doublet.
I'm feeling generous, so I'll give you a choice. Renounce this foolish infatuation publicly, pledge yourself to me before the entire court, or watch as I destroy everything and everyone you hold dear.
Isabelle's mind reeled.
You can't.
She whispered.
Can't I?
The Baron's smile was triumphant.
Your father's lands border mine. It would be a shame if some unfortunate accidents were to befall his crops, his livestock. And as for your knight...
He picked up a torn page from the sketchbook, crumpling it in his fist.
Well, the battlefield is a dangerous place. Men die in combat every day.
Horror washed over Isabelle as the full implications of his threat sank in. She thought of her father, of the innocent people who depended on him, and Raoul. The thought of him coming to harm because of her was unbearable.
You have until tomorrow to make your decision.
The Baron said, moving towards the door.
Choose wisely, my dear. Your future, and the futures of those you care about, depends on it.
As the door slammed behind him, Isabelle's legs gave way. She sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. How had everything gone so wrong? She had dared to dream of a life with Raoul, of love and happiness. Now those dreams lay shattered at her feet. For hours, Isabelle remained there, her mind cycling through desperate plans and discarding them just as quickly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her room, she came to a heart-wrenching realization. She would have to push Raoul away, for his own safety, for the safety of her family and their dependents. She would have to break both their hearts. The thought of facing Raoul, of lying to him, made her physically ill. But what choice did she have? The Baron's threats hung over her like a sword, ready to fall at the slightest provocation. Isabelle considered, for a brief, wild moment, telling Raoul the truth. But as quickly as the thought came, she dismissed it. She knew Raoul, his sense of honour, his protective nature, his fierce loyalty. If he knew of the Baron's threats, he would never stand idly by. He would confront the Baron, challenge him perhaps, and in doing so, seal his own fate. No, Raoul was a man of action. He wouldn't understand the delicate political dance required here, the careful manoeuvring needed to keep everyone safe. His righteous anger would only provoke the Baron further, potentially bringing harm not just to himself, but to Isabelle's family and all those who depended on them. And even if Raoul did restrain himself, could Isabelle bear to see the pain and helplessness in his eyes? To know that he was suffering, unable to act because of her. It would be a constant torment for both of them. Better a clean break, Isabelle thought bitterly. Better for Raoul to think she had chosen duty over love, to hate her perhaps, than to live in constant fear and frustration. As night fell, Isabelle dragged herself to her feet. She moved to the window, her eyes seeking out the training grounds where she knew Raoul would be finishing his daily exercises. Even from this distance, the sight of him made her heart ache.
I'm sorry.
She whispered, pressing her hand against the cool glass.
I'm so sorry, my love.
Tomorrow, she would have to find the strength to push him away, to convince him that their love had been a mistake. She would have to watch the light die in his eyes, knowing she was the cause. But she would do it. For his sake. For all their sakes. Isabelle turned from the window, her resolve hardening even as her heart broke. She had always known duty would demand sacrifices. She just never imagined the price would be so high. As she prepared for bed, every movement felt mechanical, as if she were watching someone else go through the motions. The future that had seemed so bright just days ago now stretched before her, bleak and loveless. Something had changed indeed, but not in the way Isabelle had hoped. Instead of finding a way forward, she found herself trapped more firmly than ever in a cage of duty and fear. Sleep eluded her that night, her dreams haunted by the Baron's threats and Raoul's imagined pain. When dawn finally broke, Isabelle rose, her face a mask of calm that belied the turmoil within. Today, she would break Raoul's heart to save his life, and in doing so, she would shatter her own. Chapter 11. Fractures of the Heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the chateau courtyard as Isabelle made her way to the chapel. Her steps were leaden, each one bringing her closer to the moment she dreaded. She had barely slept, her mind plagued by the Baron's threats and the task that lay ahead. As she approached the chapel doors, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Raoul stood there, his face a mixture of concern and hope. Isabelle's heart clenched at the sight of him.
Isabelle,
He said softly, reaching for her hand.
I've been worried. You've been avoiding me since...
Sir Raoul.
Isabelle cut him off, her voice cold and formal. She pulled her hand away before he could touch her, ignoring the flash of hurt in his eyes.
This is neither the time nor the place for such familiarity.
What's wrong? Has something happened?
Isabelle steeled herself, calling upon every lesson in poise and control she'd ever learned.
Nothing is wrong, Sir Raoul. I've simply come to my senses regarding our inappropriate behavior.
She forced herself to meet his gaze, to watch as understanding and then pain bloomed in his eyes. It took every ounce of willpower she possessed not to reach out to him, not to take back her words and confess everything.
I don't understand.
Raoul said, his voice barely above a whisper.
Isabelle, what we shared...
Was a mistake.
She finished for him, the words tasting like ash in her mouth.
A moment of weakness that cannot be repeated. I am to be married, Sir Raoul. My duty is clear.
Raoul took a step back, as if physically struck by her words.
Duty?
He repeated, a note of anger creeping into his voice.
Is that all our love means to you? A deviation from duty?
Isabelle's mask nearly cracked at the raw pain in his voice. She longed to tell him the truth, to throw herself into his arms and beg him to take her away from all of this. Instead, she straightened her spine and lifted her chin.
It means nothing.
She lied, each word a dagger to her own heart.
It was a foolish indulgence, nothing more. I suggest you forget it ever happened.
With that, she brushed past him and entered the chapel. As soon as the heavy doors closed behind her, Isabelle sagged against them, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob, closing her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. A throat cleared nearby, startling her. Isabelle's eyes flew open to see Father Thomas watching her with concern.
My child,
He said gently.
what troubles you so?
For a moment, Isabelle was tempted to confess everything. The Baron's threats, her love for Raoul, the impossible choice she faced. But the words stuck in her throat. Even here, in this sacred space, she couldn't risk being overheard.
It's nothing, Father.
She managed, forcing a smile.
Pre-wedding nerves, I suppose.
Father Thomas didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly.
The path of duty is not always easy, my dear. But remember, the Lord does not give us burdens we cannot bear.
Isabelle's smile faltered.
And if the burden feels too heavy?
She whispered. The priest's eyes softened with understanding.
Then we must have faith that there is a greater purpose to our struggles. Come, let us pray together for strength and guidance.
As Isabelle knelt before the altar, her lips moving in silent prayer, her mind was far from holy thoughts. Instead, she pictured Raoul's face, the hurt and betrayal in his eyes. She had done that to him, had willingly caused him pain to protect him. Was this to be her life now, hurting those she loved for their own good? The rest of the day passed in a blur of wedding preparations and stilted conversations. Isabelle went through the motions, her responses automatic and lifeless. More than once, she caught her father watching her with concern, but she couldn't bring herself to ease his worries. As evening fell, Isabelle found herself drawn to the castle ramparts. She stood at the edge, looking out over the town of Carcassonne, the wind whipping her hair around her face. Far below, she could see the training grounds where the knights were finishing their daily exercises. Her eyes scanned the figures, searching for the familiar form of Raoul. A frown creased her brow as she realized he wasn't there. It wasn't like him to miss training, especially not when he was upset. In the past, he had always thrown himself into his duties with even greater fervor when troubled. Isabelle's hands clenched on the stone parapet, her knuckles turning white. Where was he? Had her words driven him away completely? The thought sent a spike of panic through her heart. She had meant to push him away for his own safety, not drive him from his post, his home. A movement in the courtyard below caught her eye. The Baron had arrived, his ostentatious carriage pulling up to the main entrance. Isabelle watched as he descended, his eyes sweeping the castle as if assessing his future property. When his gaze reached the ramparts, Isabelle instinctively stepped back into the shadows. Her retreat brought her up against something solid and warm. Isabelle whirled around to find Raoul standing there, his face a mask of carefully controlled emotion.
Hiding from your betrothed?
He asked, his voice low and bitter. Isabelle's heart raced. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't prepared herself for another confrontation.
I was just getting some air.
She stammered. Raoul's eyes searched her face, looking for something, some sign that her earlier words had been a lie, perhaps.
You can't go through with this, Isabelle.
He said, a note of pleading entering his voice.
I know you. I've seen your heart. This isn't what you want.
For a moment, Isabelle wavered. The urge to confess everything, To throw herself into Raoul's arms and beg him to take her away from all of this was almost overwhelming. But then she remembered the Baron's threats, the lives that hung in the balance.
What I want doesn't matter.
She said, her voice barely above a whisper.
This is who I am, Raoul. Lady Isabelle de Montefort, soon to be Baroness de Sauveterre. It's time we both accepted that.
She made to move past him, but Raoul caught her arm.
Look me in the eye.
He demanded.
Look me in the eye and tell me you don't love me.
Isabelle raised her gaze to his, seeing the desperate hope there. She opened her mouth, the lie poised on her lips. But no sound came out. She couldn't do it. She couldn't deny her love for him. Not to his face. Not like this. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken words and impossible desires. Then, from below, came the sound of the Baron's voice, calling for his bride-to-be. Reality crashed back in. Isabelle wrenched her arm from Raoul's grasp, stumbling backwards.
I have to go.
She choked out.
Please, Raoul, just let me go.
As she fled down the stairs, Isabelle's mind was in turmoil. She had failed to convince Raoul, failed to fully embrace her duty, failed to protect her heart. How could she possibly navigate the treacherous waters ahead when she couldn't even master her own emotions? The Baron was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, his smile cold and possessive.
Ah, there you are, my dear. Come, we have much to discuss about our future.
As Isabelle allowed herself to be led away, she cast one last glance over her shoulder. Raoul stood at the top of the stairs, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. He looked lost, diminished somehow, and Isabelle knew that her own heart mirrored his desolation. Chapter 12. Armour Undone. Dawn broke over Carcassonne, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Isabelle stood at her chamber window, her fingers tracing the cold glass. For days, she had been going through the motions, a puppet dancing to the Baron's tune. But with each passing hour, the weight of her decision pressed harder upon her heart. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie.
Enter,
she called, expecting Marie with her morning tea. Instead, a small furry bundle was thrust into her arms. Isabelle gasped, looking down into the familiar green eyes of the kitten she and Raoul had rescued in the marketplace weeks ago.
What?
She began, looking up to find Raoul standing in her doorway, his eyes blazing with determination.
I couldn't bear to see you caged.
He said softly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him.
Not when your spirit is as free as this little one's.
Isabelle clutched the kitten to her chest, feeling its tiny heart beat against her own.
Raoul, you shouldn't be here. If the Baron finds out.
Let him.
Raoul interrupted, his voice fierce.
I'm done hiding, Isabelle. I'm done pretending that what we have isn't worth fighting for.
He crossed the room in 2 strides, cupping her face in his hands.
I know you're scared. I am too. But I'd rather face the Baron's wrath 1,000 times over than spend another day without you.
Tears welled in Isabelle's eyes.
But the threats. My family. The people who depend on us.
Raoul's thumbs gently wiped away her tears.
We'll face it together. Your father is a good man, Isabelle. If we tell him the truth, explain the situation.
No!
Isabelle pulled away, setting the kitten down on a nearby cushion. It mewed softly, watching them with curious eyes.
You don't understand. The Baron, he has ways of making people disappear. If anything happened to you because of me, I couldn't...
Her voice broke, and Raoul gathered her into his arms.
Nothing will happen to me.
He murmured into her hair.
I've faced worse odds on the battlefield, and this...
He pulled back, meeting her gaze.
This is worth any risk.
Isabelle searched his face, seeing the love and determination written there. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope in her chest.
I'm so tired of being afraid,
she whispered.
Then let's be brave together.
Raoul replied, a small smile tugging at his lips.
You once told me you wanted a life that means something. Let's make that life, Isabelle. You and me.
As if in response, the kitten let out a demanding meow. Isabelle couldn't help but laugh. the sound rusty from disuse, but genuine.
And our furry little friend, it seems.
Raoul's smile widened.
I went back to the herbalist to find her. It took some convincing and most of my savings, but I knew she belonged with you.
Isabelle's heart swelled at the gesture. This was the man she loved, kind, thoughtful, willing to move heaven and earth for those he cared about. How could she have ever considered giving him up?
Raoul,
She began, her voice thick with emotion.
I'm so sorry for pushing you away. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just...
Shh, he soothed, pressing a finger to her lips.
No more apologies. We both did what we thought was right. But now,
His eyes sparkled with mischief.
I think it's time we did what we know is right.
Before Isabelle could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Angry voices approached, one unmistakably belonging to the Baron. Raoul tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the sword at his hip. But Isabelle, feeling a surge of courage she didn't know she possessed, stepped in front of him. The door burst open, revealing the Baron, his face contorted with rage.
You treacherous little...
He began, but Isabelle cut him off.
Enough.
She cried, her voice ringing with authority.
I will not be bullied or threatened any longer. This farce of an engagement is over.
The Baron's eyes narrowed dangerously.
You forget yourself, my lady. Our union is not for you to decide.
No.
Came a new voice from the hallway. Lord Henri stepped into view, his face grave.
But it is for me to decide, and I will not see my daughter married to a man who resorts to threats and coercion.
Isabelle's heart soared at her father's words, but the Baron was not so easily defeated.
Very well.
He snarled, his gaze fixed on Raoul.
If I cannot have the lady's hand, I shall at least have satisfaction. Sir Raoul, I challenge you to a duel, unless...
His lip curled in a sneer.
You're too cowardly to face me.
Raoul stepped forward, his stance proud and unflinching.
I accept.
The Baron's smile was cold and triumphant.
Excellent. Tomorrow at dawn in the main courtyard. Rapiers, as is proper for gentlemen. I trust you're familiar with the weapon.
Isabelle saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Raoul's face. The rapier was a dueling weapon, far different from the broadswords used in battle. But Raoul's voice was steady as he replied,
I am.
The Baron swept from the room with a knowing smirk. As the tension in the room eased slightly, Isabelle turned to her father, confusion and gratitude warring in her eyes.
Father, I don't understand. How did you know?
Lord Henry's face softened as he looked at his daughter.
My dear, I may be old, but I'm not blind. I've seen the change in you these past weeks, the joy when Sir Raoul was near, and the despair as the wedding drew closer.
He sighed heavily.
But it was Marie who finally opened my eyes to the full extent of the Baron's cruelty.
Isabelle gasped.
Marie.
Her father nodded.
She came to me last night, terrified but determined. She told me everything, the Baron's threats, his treatment of the staff, and how he'd been trying to bully and bribe everyone into spying on you and Sir Raoul.
His eyes hardened.
I may have arranged this match, Isabelle, but I would never force you to marry a man capable of such malice.
Tears welled in Isabelle's eyes as she embraced her father.
Thank you.
She whispered. Lord Henry hugged her tightly before stepping back, his expression grave once more.
But we're not out of danger yet. The Baron won't give up easily, and this duel...
He trailed off, looking worriedly at Raoul. Raoul straightened, meeting Lord Henry's gaze steadily.
I give you my word, my lord. I will fight with every ounce of skill and honor I possess.
Lord Henry nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes.
See that you do, Sir Raoul. My daughter's happiness depends on it.
With a final nod to them both, he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Isabelle turned to Raoul, her heart pounding.
Raoul, you can't. The Baron is a master duelist. He's killed men for far less.
Raoul pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead.
I have to, my love. It's the only way to end this once and for all.
Isabelle clutched at his tunic, fear and love warring within her.
Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back to me.
Raoul's arms tightened around her.
Wild horses couldn't keep me away.
As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the kitten wove between their legs, purring contentedly. It was a moment of perfect unity, a family forged in adversity, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Isabelle couldn't shake the cold dread that had settled in her stomach. Tomorrow would decide everything, and all she could do was pray that their newfound courage would be enough to see them through. Chapter 13. Hearts United. The morning of the duel dawned crisp and clear. Isabelle stood at the edge of the courtyard, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Raoul prepare. His movements were calm and methodical as he tested the weight of the unfamiliar rapier, but Isabelle could see the tension in his shoulders.
Remember,
She said softly, reaching out to straighten his collar.
you're not just fighting for honor. You're fighting for us, for our future.
Raoul caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm.
For you, my love, I'd fight the world.
As the Baron strutted into the courtyard, a smirk playing on his lips, Isabelle felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his eyes, a cold calculation that made her blood run cold. The duel began with a flurry of movement. The Baron lunged forward, his rapier a silver streak aimed at Raoul's heart. Raoul barely managed to deflect the blow, the unfamiliar weight of the rapier throwing off his timing. The Baron pressed his advantage, launching a series of swift attacks, high, low, then a feint followed by a thrust that nearly slipped past Raoul's guard. Isabelle's breath caught in her throat as she watched Raoul stumble back, narrowly avoiding the Baron's blade. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. The Baron's lips curled into a triumphant sneer as he advanced, his rapier weaving an intricate pattern of death. But as the fight wore on, something changed. Raoul's movements, at first awkward and defensive, began to flow more naturally. He might not have been trained in the rapier, but years of combat had honed his instincts. His parries became more precise, his footwork more assured. The Baron launched a vicious lunge, aiming for Raoul's shoulder. This time Raoul not only parried the attack, but riposted with a quick thrust of his own. The Baron's eyes widened in surprise as he was forced to take a step back. Slowly, surely, Raoul began to push the Baron back. He combined techniques from his battlefield experience with the formal movements of dueling. A sweeping parry borrowed from broadsword combat flowed into a delicate touch to the Baron's blade, sending it just wide of its mark. An aggressive advance reminiscent of a cavalry charge became a series of precise steps, pressing the Baron towards the edge of the dueling ground. Isabelle watched in awe as Raoul transformed before her eyes, melding the raw power of a knight with the finesse of a duelist. For every thrust the Baron made, Raoul now had an answer. High, low, feint, and riposte. The two men moved in a deadly dance, blades flashing in the morning sun. The Baron's smirk faltered, replaced by a snarl of frustration. And then, in a move so quick Isabelle almost missed it, he reached into his pocket and flung a handful of dirt into Raoul's eyes.
Raoul!
Isabelle cried out in warning, but it was too late. Blinded, Raoul stumbled, his guard dropping for a crucial moment. The Baron lunged, his rapier aimed straight for Raoul's heart. But at the last second, Raoul twisted, the blade slicing his arm instead of his chest. In the same motion, he brought his own weapon up and around, disarming the Baron with a move born of battlefield improvisation, rather than dueling finesse. The Baron's rapier clattered to the ground, and Raoul's blade came to rest at his throat.
Yield.
Raoul commanded, his voice steady despite the blood trickling down his arm. For a moment, the Baron's eyes darted around, seeking escape, but finding none he spat out,
I yield.
A cheer went up from the gathered crowd. Isabelle rushed forward, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. She threw her arms around Raoul, uncaring of propriety or the blood now staining her dress.
You did it.
She whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
You came back to me.
Raoul's arm tightened around her waist.
Always, my love, always.
Lord Henry stepped forward, his face stern as he addressed the Baron.
Your duplicity and dishonorable conduct have been witnessed by all present. You are no longer welcome on Montfort lands. I will be informing the Count of Carcassonne of your actions here today, including your attempts at coercion and your violation of the sacred rules of combat.
The Baron's face paled slightly at the mention of the Count. Lord Henri continued, his voice carrying the weight of his position.
I strongly suggest you leave our lands immediately. The Count will decide what further action to take regarding your presence in Carcassonne.
Isabelle, standing tall in Raoul's embrace, added coolly,
I'm sure the Count will be most interested to hear about your threats against his vassals and your dishonorable conduct in a formal duel.
The Baron, his face twisted with rage and humiliation, was led away by the Montfort guards to the edge of their territory. As he passed Isabelle and Raoul, he hissed,
This isn't over.
but Isabelle merely raised an eyebrow.
Oh, I rather think it is.
She replied, her voice steady.
The Count does not look kindly on those who disturb the peace of his lands.
As the excitement died down, and Raoul's wound was tended to, Lord Henri approached the couple. His eyes were warm as he looked at his daughter, seeing the joy that radiated from her.
Sir Raoul,
He began, his voice carrying the weight of formal declaration.
you have proven yourself a man of honor, courage, and resourcefulness. More importantly, you have won my daughter's heart.
He paused, a smile tugging at his lips.
And I must admit my own approval.
Isabelle's breath caught in her throat as her father continued.
As you know, Isabelle is my only child and heir. It has long been my concern that her future husband might seek to usurp her rightful place as the next ruler of our lands.
Lord Henry's gaze sharpened as he looked at Raoul.
But I see in you a partner, not a conqueror, someone who will stand beside my daughter, supporting her as she leads.
Raoul bowed deeply.
My lord, your trust honors me. I swear to you, I will spend every day of my life striving to be worthy of Isabelle and the faith you've placed in me.
Lord Henry nodded, satisfied.
Then let it be known that upon my passing, the lands and titles of House Montfort will pass to Isabelle and Raoul jointly, to rule together as equal partners.
Isabelle felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. She looked up at Raoul, seeing her joy mirrored in his eyes. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. Love, partnership, the chance to make a difference in the world. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light over Carcassonne, Isabelle and Raoul stood hand in hand, facing their future together. The path ahead would not always be easy, but they would face every challenge side by side. Later that evening, as they stood on the castle ramparts watching the sunset, Raoul pulled Isabelle close.
Do you remember that day in the marketplace,
He asked softly.
when we rescued that little kitten?
Isabelle smiled, leaning into his embrace.
How could I forget? It was the day my life changed forever.
Raoul chuckled.
Mine too. I knew then, watching you stand up to those boys, seeing your compassion and your fire. I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for my whole life.
Isabelle turned in his arms, reaching up to trace the scar on his jaw.
And you were the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was making.
She whispered.
My brave knight, my partner, my love.
As their lips met in a tender kiss, the little kitten, now a permanent resident of the castle, wound its way between their feet, purring contentedly. And Isabelle knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that this was where she belonged. Here, in Raoul's arms, with a future full of promise stretching out before them. They had faced fear, duty, and danger, and emerged stronger for it. Together, they would write their own story, one of love, courage, and the power of two hearts beating as one.